Greetings, everyone. I hope you've been enjoying our series on Habakkuk. We've looked at chapters 1 and 2. Now it's time to conclude with chapter 3. By way of a little bit of review, so we're all caught up with one another, we saw in the first two chapters how Habakkuk the prophet started by looking at his own country and seeing all the wrong and all the evil and wickedness, and he lamented it to God and said, "Why are you making me see all these things? Why don't you do something about it?" Well, then God shows him his plan for the future about how he's going to use the Chaldeans, the great nation that's rising in power, even though they are wicked. He's going to use them to come and judge his people for their wicked deeds. And the prophet cries out in distress against this and says, "You can't do that. You won't do that. That's not who you are. That's not how you operate." Then God shows him in chapter 2 that he misunderstands righteousness. He misunderstands how righteousness comes about. And he says in the famous verse 4 that the righteous will live by faith. That even though the Chaldeans are technically, or not even technically, but mathematically perhaps, they have more sins, they've done more evil, quote unquote, than the Jewish nation, righteousness is not achieved by how few sins one has committed. It's achieved by faith. And so God is going to use the Chaldeans to punish the Judeans, but he is going to punish the Chaldeans as well. He is just, and he will bring justice to all. And there's more to the story, of course. He goes through various sins and evils that they have done, and why he is going to punish them for that. And at the end, he ends chapter 2 saying, "I have said enough. There will be no more arguments. Let all the earth be silent before him, because the Lord is in his holy temple." That he is coming, he is just and righteous. He has given time. We are very late and very close to the destruction of Jerusalem at this point. He has given hundreds of years and dozens of prophets. All have been sacrificed to give this people more time. And there's to be no more arguments. Let all the earth be silent before him. And so the prophet Habakkuk, before we look at chapter 3, he has started out looking around at his present situation. And then when God showed him his plan, he revealed to him his plan, he was too focused on the wrong thing. He looked around at what irritated him, at what confused and concerned him, but he never looked in the right place. His focus has always been on the situation that concerns Habakkuk's physical life. He has been primarily concerned with the world around him, what he does and doesn't like, or how God should and shouldn't interact with it. But in chapter 3, Habakkuk finally looks in the right place. He finally puts his focus, I think, in the correct area, is that he looks up instead of looking around or maybe down. He looks up and looks to God for his help. So let's get into chapter 3 and see how this book ends in a very beautiful way. Begins in verse 1, he says, "A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet according to Shigionoth." I'm going to pause right there because this last chapter is actually a psalm. Not all the psalms are found in the book of Psalms, in case you didn't know that. There's a fair few scattered throughout the rest of the book. And here we find a prayer, or you could call it a psalm, of Habakkuk, and it's according to a specific type that's very emotional. And you see, this has not just been a academic debate between God and his prophet. This is his own people he's talking about. These are real people. This is his life. This is the life of his friends and his family. This is the life of his countrymen. These are real country, real people, and real emotions. This has been a very emotional encounter with God. From discouragement at looking around to disbelief. And now he's come to a different place. And so he has this poem, this prayer he's going to pray to God. And it's very, very emotionally charged. He begins in verse 2 and says, "Lord, I have heard the report about you and I fear. O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy." this first part's kind of a really short synopsis of everywhere this psalm's going to go. Pretty much, he's going to expand further in this psalm, but he says here at the beginning, by way of introduction, if you will, he says, "Lord, I've heard the report about you. I've heard what you're going to do, and I fear. I fear." Then he says, "O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years." In the midst of the years, make it known. Because he knows what God has done in the past, and he's going to go into the past in just a moment and look at the great things God has done. But he says, "Lord, I want you to do something in the midst of the years. I want you to do something in the present time." And we know God will. You see, he's moving his focus away from what he doesn't like about the situation to the right focus. He's looking toward God and his power and his mercy. He says, "In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy." Lord, I know you have to come. I know you have to punish the unjust. Just remember mercy when you come. He says in verse 3 and following, he says, "God comes from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covers the heavens, and the earth is full of his praise. His radiance is like the sunlight. He has rays flashing from his hand, and there is the hiding of his power." He references Mount Paran in the south, in the desert regions there. He says God's coming up from the southlands, almost like in Moses' day when God was with his people in the southlands, coming towards the land of promise. Coming in glory and splendor. He says coming like the sunshine, coming like the sunlight breaking over the mountains. You got the rays flashing in his hands. It's just the brilliance of God coming up from the south. And there's the interesting phrase that says, "and there is the hiding of his power." It's almost as if it seems that God's magnificence outshines even God's great power as God comes up. He goes on in verse 5 and says, "Before him goes pestilence, and plague comes after him. He stood and surveyed the earth. He looked and startled the nations. Yes, the perpetual mountains were shattered, and the ancient hills collapsed. His ways are everlasting. I saw the tents of Cushan under distress, and the tent curtains of the land of Midian were trembling." You see, God is coming in power. He sees God coming in all his power to do forth justice. Pestilence and plague are with him. Tools he used against the Egyptians, he used against many nations. His vessels of judgment of various kinds. He says he looks and he surveys the earth, he looks and he startles the nations, and it's as if even the mountains quake and tremble before him, and they fall down at his feet because his ways are everlasting. This is the Jehovah mighty God coming. He says he sees the tents of Cushan under distress. That would be the area of Ethiopia, enemies of Israel in the past who came, and God defeated them in mighty victory with the hand of his people. And the same for Midian. Midian would be specifically in Gideon's story with the 300 men of Gideon that God used to smite the Midians when his people were in danger. And that's what he's calling up to mind here. He's calling up times in the past when God came to save his people. And he came with his mighty power. He says in verse 8, "Did the Lord rage against the rivers? Or was your anger against the rivers? Or was your wrath against the sea that you rode on your horses, on your chariots of salvation?" And the answer to that, I think, is no. You see, God used the Red Sea to defeat the armies of Egypt, and he spread across the Jordan Sea so Joshua's men could enter the land, and he's used waters at various times to do his will. But he's not angry with the waters when he used them that way. They were merely tools. Verse 9, he says, "Your bow was made bare, the rods of chastisement were sworn. You cleaved the earth with rivers, the mountains saw you and quaked. The downpour of waters swept by, the deep uttered forth its voice. It lifted high its hands. Sun and moon stood in their places, and they went away at the light of your arrows, at the radiance of your gleaming spear. In indignation you marched through the earth, in anger you trampled the nations." See, God is coming, and nothing can stand against his might. Nothing can stand against his might. You see, God is all powerful. God is so powerful that the idea of nations or nature itself standing up against him in any way is laughable at best. The mountains are going to quake, the rivers split, new rivers formed where mountains once stood, nations will fall easily. He calls to mind the sun and the moon standing in their place like it did in the past days, in great times of distress in battle that God blessed. And then there's a really important verse here, verse 13. You see, you might get the impression that God is just doing this because God likes beating people up. God likes destroying stuff, that God is a God of anger, and he's merely a God of war like so many pagan gods are. That distress and destruction are just the way he normally operates. And you would miss the point of what's all going on here. But verse 13 clears it up for us. He says, "You went forth for the salvation of your people. For the salvation of your anointed, you struck the head of the house of the evil, to lay him open from thigh to neck." It's not just capriciousness or selfishness or just because God likes beating people up that God marches to war. God goes in judgment on a nation or a people or anyone. It's for the salvation of his people. Always for the salvation of his people. He's called to mind many times in the past, the Red Sea, for instance. The Egyptians got beat up. They did. A lot of them got beat up. The firstborn were slain, all the plagues, and their whole army wiped out in the Red Sea. Why did God do that? Because he'd heard his people's cry. Slavery for generations, and he comes and he saves his people. He comes in power and might through the hand of Moses, his servant. And he smites the Egyptians for the salvation of his people. And that's the way it always is when God comes in judgment. When God comes in judgment, he comes to save the righteous from the evil. And he's going to strike the head of the evil and lay him open from foundation to neck, one translation says, all the way, every part. He says in verse 14, "You pierced with his own spears the head of his throngs. They stormed in to scatter us, and their exultation was like those who devour the oppressed in secret. You trampled on the sea with your horses, on the surge of many waters." That concludes this section of the psalm, is that God can use all kinds of things to destroy his enemies and the enemies of his people. How he can use his own spears against him. Babylon itself will fall in this manner, because the Babylonians have allied with the Medes and the Persians to destroy the Assyrians and the other enemies. But God will put a rift, and the Medes and the Persians will destroy the Babylonians, so their own spears will pierce his warriors. Civil war, if you will. Now we come to the last part, and it's maybe the most beautiful expression of faith, the most powerful expression of faith, maybe in the whole book, the whole Bible. Not just this psalm in this book of Habakkuk. Because Habakkuk finally comes to the place we all must come. He's no longer merely looking at his surrounding situation. You can't help but look a little bit at your surrounding situation. That's not merely where he's looking. And he's not looking for help for God to ease his present situation, because he understands that God's plan must come to pass. And for that to happen, sometimes we must go through things that are not pleasant. But he finally understands that the righteous will live by faith. Not by their deeds, not by their own strength. They'll live by faith, and faith in the God of heaven. He says in verse 16, "I heard and my inward parts trembled. At the sound my lips quivered. Decay enters my bones, and in my place I tremble. Because I must quietly wait for the day of distress, for the people to arise who will invade us." He says, God, I finally understand and I accept. But it brings great distress, because I am the one who has to wait. Like an athlete before a game, or a soldier before a charge into battle, or like a family sheltering in a cellar before a great storm. He knows it's coming. He knows the storm is coming. I must quietly wait for the nation to invade us. He says in verse 17, though the fig trees should not blossom, and there be no fruit on the vines, though the yield of the olive should fail, and the fields produce no food, though the flock should be cut off from the fold, and there be no cattle in the stalls, yet I will exult in the Lord. Every manner of food, I think, that Israel has in that ancient time, every manner of sustenance, of even prosperity and wealth, the vine, the fig tree, the crop, the fields, and the flock, and the cattle. He says, if all of them fail, if all of them are carried off, if none of them happen, and there's no more food of any kind, there's no more prosperity of any kind, there's no more sustenance of any kind, God, if they're all gone, every bit of it, there's no more way to physically sustain me in this nation, yet I will exult in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength, and he has made my feet like hinds or deer's feet, and makes me walk on my high places. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a statement of faith. That is the place we all must come to. Whatever, no matter what happens, anytime, this time, in the future, doesn't matter. That's the time we must come to. That's the realization we must come to, that the righteous will live by faith. That even if the world falls apart around us, it doesn't matter. Why? Because we are on the side of the God of heaven. We are on the side of the mighty God of Israel. He says, if everything fails, my whole country, my whole little world falls apart, I'm going to rejoice in the Lord. I'm going to exult in the God of my strength. There's this interesting passage of conclusion. He says, he's made my feet like hinds' feet and makes me walk on my high places. Well, if you've ever seen a deer or a mountain goat or ever chased an elk uphill, you'll know that they can climb a hill mighty fast. You see, he says, God is my strength. He makes me like that deer or that goat to climb that hill. I escape the valley where the shadow is, the valley of the shadow of death, you might could say, from Psalm 23. He brings me from the valley where the danger and the dark and the despair is, and he gives me strength to climb that mountain to the top of victory. And that's what God does for his people, because even though he has to come in judgment sometimes, he comes in judgment for salvation for his people. So the question that leaves us as this book leaves us, and we end together, is, are you one of God's people? Are you living by faith? Because if you are, then no difficulty, no trouble, no war, sickness, disease, plague, or anything else can get you down. Because you're on the side of the God of heaven. He gives you strength to climb out of those valleys and get up on those mountains. I pray this message finds all of you in good health and good spirits. And it's been a pleasure to look through the book of Habakkuk with you.